Hello, Yellow Jackets. I'm with you again today with permission from Scholastic to read I Survived, the Eruption of Mount St. Helens, 1980. And when we were together last time, we read chapters 1 and 2. So today we're going to read chapters 3 and 4. And if you remember last time, we left off where Jess and the twins were trying to decide what they were going to do if they saw Skeleton Woman out in the woods. So we're going to pick up with chapter 3. They pulled into the parking lot at the lake, and Mr. Roman came around to open the tailgate. "Hello, troops," he boomed. With his big belly, bushy beard, and laughing eyes, Mr. Roman had always reminded Jess of a younger version of Santa Claus. Mrs. Roman was about half his size and about twice as strict. They all loved her, of course. Mrs. Roman was Jess's mom's best friend. But today, the boys didn't seem too upset that their no-nonsense mom wasn't there to keep them in line. Mrs. Roman was away for the week. She was taking care of the twins' grandma, who lived about 50 miles from Cedar. There were 2 other cars in the parking lot today, a beat-up Toyota and a white pickup. There was an older woman standing by the truck. Even from a distance, they could see her long gray braid and bright smile. "Hello," she called with a wave. "What a day!" "You said it," Mr. Roman exclaimed. It was usually pouring rain here in late March, but this morning the sky was bright blue and the sun shined down. "And just look at our pretty mountain," Mr. Roman said, putting an arm around each of the boys and smiling up at St. Helens. The mountain's lower slopes were blanketed with green trees. The top was covered with snow. It's a perfect triangle peak sparkled in the sun. Jess always felt a splash of pride when she looked at St. Helens. No, it wasn't as famous as Mount Hood, across the border in Oregon, and it wasn't as tall as Mount Rainier, which loomed over Seattle, and about 200 miles to the north of Cedar. But folks who lived here knew St. Helens was the most beautiful mountain in the Cascade Range, and if most people had ever heard of it, who cared? Mr. Roman gathered his supplies and headed up to the fishing cabin. "I'll be organizing my gear," he called. "Don't go far. And Jess, keep those boys out of trouble." "Will do," Jess promised. Jess and the twins watched him disappear down a little path that led to the cabin. "This is going to be fun," Sam said, rubbing his hands together. "Fun?" Eddie said. "Let's face it," Jess said. "We have nothing better to do." The twins nodded. Cedar wasn't a terrible place, but it sure was dull. Only about 400 people lived there. The closest grocery store was 20 miles away. Last weekend, the big excitement was the elk that wandered onto Main Street and blocked traffic for an hour. But Jess and the twins had their mountain and forests, and they had each other. Eddie held out his hand, palm up. Jess and Sam laid theirs on top. It was the 3-way handshake they had made up in kindergarten. "All for one," Sam said. "And one for all," Jess and Eddie chorused. Dad had taught them that saying a long time ago. It was from the 3 Musketeers, which was a book from before it became the name of a candy bar. The book was about 3 best friends who do anything for each other, like Jess and the twins. They linked arms and started marching towards the dark woods. "Watch out, Skeleton Woman," Sam screamed. "We're coming to get you." Chapter 4. Missy had always said the shack was about a half a mile up the winding trail above the lake. They figured it would be about 30 minutes to get there. The twins walked slightly ahead. Right away, they started bickering about who was the best pitcher on the Seattle Mariners. The baseball team was only 3 years old, and it wasn't very good. The boys had become instant fans. Their dream was to see a home game in person, but they'd never been to Seattle. Neither had Jess. Missy had gone there last month for her birthday. She came back bragging about eating this fancy steak, and of course she'd seen the Mariners game. The twins hated hearing about that. Soon they crossed over to the best part of the forest, with old trees that soared up high. It seemed they were touching the sky. Jess breathed in the spicy smell of the pines. Her ponytail swung in the chilly breeze. Her mind drifted, and the twins' bickering voices faded. She walked light steps, whispering the names of every tree and flower, careful not to trample any saplings or mushrooms as she stepped. It was how Dad taught her to be in the forest. He'd loved it there so much. He and Mom and Jess had come up whenever they could sneak away from the little diner they owned in Cedar. They'd camp under the trees and hike the trails. Dad would stop every minute to photograph Mom, or Jess, or some birds perched on a branch. He'd saved up for 2 years to buy his camera, and his dream had been for one of his photographs to be shown in a gallery in Seattle. No, he had never taken any photography classes. He'd never worked any place other than the diner. But you'd never know. Anything's possible, Dad always said. And the way he looked at Jess, his eyes bright with hope, she didn't doubt it. Maybe he'd gotten his optimism from his granddad. Clive lived in the southern Washington state. When he was just 16, he went to work as a lumberjack. Back when there were no highways or restaurants in town, there were still wolves in the woods, grizzly bears that stood 10 feet tall. But mainly there were trees, and some of the most spectacular trees on earth. The oldest ones had been before George Washington was born, before the Mayflower sailed, when the only people there were the Native Americans who were quietly hunting and fishing among the trees. But that all changed in the 1800s when American settlers came. They chased away most of the native people. Lumber companies bought up the forest. They sent men like Clive to cut down the trees. Soon enough, most of those century-old trees had been chopped into wood to build ships and railroads and buildings for Americans' brand new cities. Lumberjacking was dangerous. The biggest trees weighed 50 tons, as much as a train car. They came crashing down with so much force that the earth shook a mile away. Men were crushed by falling branches. They lost feet and hands to the blades of axes. Clive himself was almost blinded by a spray of razor-sharp wood chips. But it wasn't the danger that got to Clive. It was watching all those big trees disappear. He grew to hate the grinding sound of saws and axes. He dreaded the moment when a tree started to fall over, and how its wood would moan and creak as though it were crying out in agony. So he quit working at the lumber company and opened a diner he named Clive's. Folks sure do come to the diner. But Clive would never listen. After 50 years, Clive's diner was still there, passed down to the proud family like a priceless treasure. Dad had taken it over when his own dad passed away, and he and Mom ran it together until Dad's car accident 2 years ago. After Dad died, Mom wasn't sure she wanted to stay in Cedar. She'd always dreamed of becoming a teacher, of living in the city, like Seattle. But how could she close the diner that had been in Dad's family for generations? And how would she leave Cedar? Every dark crack in the sidewalk reminded them of Dad. Sometimes it felt like Mom and Jess were rooted here just like the old trees. Thinking about all that made Jess feel dizzy, as if she were teetering on the edge of a cliff. Then Sam's voice jolted her back. "There it is!" he cried. Jess looked ahead. It was the shack. It sat there in the distance as though it had been waiting for them. I hope you'll join me next time as we continue on chapters 5 and 6.